You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 267 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking the Korean peace process. A couple of major stories to catch up on. The David Sanger article where he points out this new study and he claims that this proves that Kim Jong-un is deceiving Donald Trump and secretly upgrading North Korea's missile capabilities, all the while pertaining to buy into this peace process with Donald Trump. And then there's this story that I've mostly seen coming from social media, and that is on, I believe Thursday, sometime over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, we saw North and South Korean soldiers shaking hands at the 38th parallel there. Of course, the artificial armistice line that is separated and kind of created those two countries. So I think overall some positive stuff to talk about on today's show, which isn't always the case on Foreign Policy Focus. So, this may be a good one to share. The Libertarian Institute is the best place to find all my work. On the homepage there, you can find my daily news roundup. There's the blog section there where I sometimes post, and then also the show is on the homepage. Also, check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. I recently added some new patron tiers there to offer different kind of rewards for different level donors. The response from y'all has been great. As far as on Patreon goes. I mean, I really appreciate it to, get like kind of feedback that the show must be pretty good because some of you are willing to voluntarily pay me for it. So I really appreciate it. If you're enjoying the show and, you want to help it out, I'm going to use the money you donate to work back into the show, upgrading audio, hardware, stuff like that to make it sound better. Could run ads in the future. If you want to donate to this show and then make a suggestion what I do with the money, I'm always open to that too. So think about there, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. I'm going to be starting hopefully next weekend. I'll do the first episode of my new show. I'm doing Immersion News Radio. Want to do like a show once a week, once every other week. Just kind of a quick thing talking about something other than foreign policy that I think is important. Probably a lot of police stuff. So the patrons who donate enough money will get that show as well. Last thing I want to mention here in the opening, check out minds.com. Is something that myself and Mance Raider talked a lot about in the last episode of the show, 275. My channel there is Immersion News. I'm posting there all the time. So think about going on there. Trying out a new social media experience. It's kind of based on the blockchain. They're really working towards decentralization, and I really enjoy the platform so far. It works well. All right, so now on to some Korean stuff. The first thing I guess I should mention here is that every time I do a show on the Korean peace process, and this is something I've been optimistic about since the very beginning. I don't want to hide whatever, bias you think I have on the issue, but really since the beginning of this year when we had Kim Jong-un suggest in his New Year's speech that he would like the North Koreans to participate in the Olympic Games that were being held in South Korea. And then, the negotiations that started from there, including a delegation being sent to South Korea from North Korea, including the leader's sister and some other high-ranking members. The fact that the Koreans entered under a unified Korean flag, North and South Korean athletes at the Winter Games. I know there was talk of some joint teams. I can't remember back if they actually fielded any, but these are the kinds of events surrounding the Olympics that really got this whole thing kicked off. Then you start to have meetings between North and South Korean officials, and this leads up, to a really big meeting, a summit between Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, and Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea. This was a very public thing. It was outside. Both leaders crossed the border into the other country. They embraced. They had quite a long conversation between each other. And remember, just a few months before you have this event, the tone through most of 2017, especially the second half of 2017, was very hostile between the United States and North Korea. And South Korea is obviously in the American axis. And so, we're putting missile defense systems in South Korea because Donald Trump is threatening fire and fury against the North Koreans and calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man. And North Korea is firing back, saying that, making threats against the United States. And a very significant development, having both a ICBM, which was either nearly operational or actually operational, and then a nuclear weapon and possibly a miniaturized nuclear warhead that could go on top of an ICBM missile. Now, as far as the ability of the North Korean government, in 2017 and I guess their current capabilities to actually put a nuclear warhead on top of an ICBM and launch it at a target in the United States, with any kind of accuracy seems to me to, probably still be unlikely. That this isn't a capability that the North Koreans have. However, since, these positive steps have started taking place at the Winter Games, the North Koreans have agreed to a long offer deal by the Chinese, which is something of a freeze for freeze policy, where the U.S. really ramps down the war games in South Korea, and in exchange, the North Koreans end their missile and nuclear testing. So far, no nuclear tests, no missile tests. We then have the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. This is a very historic event. First time it's ever happened. You have like a memorandum signed at the end of that summit. It's not necessarily like a peace agreement or anything like that, but, the leaders agreed to start, making certain steps. And actually North Korea agreed to an additional thing kind of at the end, which was to destroy a missile engine testing facility. Something that Donald Trump just brought up. So that was one thing that came out of the meeting, although I don't think it was signed on the official agreement that North Korea actually committed to. They've returned the remains of U.S. soldiers since the summit, have continued in their commitment to not test nuclear weapons or missiles, and they have also destroyed their nuclear testing sites. Now, one outstanding issue here between the United States and North Korea in the peace process is North Korea seems to really advocate for and believe in a process where they make concessions. So maybe they give up the location of their nuclear weapons and missiles, and in exchange, they get some sanctions relief or something like that. Maybe if they agree to give up 10 nuclear weapons or agree to shut off a nuclear reactor that could produce the type of nuclear fuel that could be easily enriched into nuclear weapons, they turn that off, and then they get some more different either to fuel aid or energy relief of some type like that. Whereas the American position is that North Korea must completely, verifiably, and forever denuclearize before they see any sanctions relief. I think if you're, just looking at how we all imagine diplomacy would work here, where you try to build trust and each side takes a step, the North Korean model certainly makes more sense. Now, I don't know how much hope there is of convincing Trump of that. And, if we would actually see the U.S. government start to take steps here. But as I'm going to get into a little bit later when it comes to sanctions, I think the U.S. may start to have a little bit of trouble enforcing the sanction. So anyways, my original point I wanted to make here was just that these are the reasons that I'm optimistic about the Korean peace process, is because we've seen all these positive steps take place, and also the fact that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, and Moon Jae-in, the leader of South Korea, seem to really be dedicated towards making this peace process work. If there was one person I would give like the Nobel Peace Prize to, or, just the award for being most helpful in making this happen, I think it's Moon Jae-in. If you look at the steps he's taken to try to convince the Americans that the North Koreans are serious about willing to give up their weapons, they're absolutely huge. I mean, I'm sure, that he's taking political risks. He's really staking his probably career on the Korean peace process. Is such a big topic, not only in the world and U.S. media, but, especially in South Korea. And so far, it's paid off huge for him. He has very favorable poll numbers, a lot of support among the South Korean people. And in fact, the most hostile party in South Korea against, getting along with the North Koreans has actually been, losing support and losing members and seats in their parliament. So it seems from that side, this has the support of the South Korean president, the South Korean people. It has support of the North Korean leader. Don't know what the North Korean people think, but I'm guessing it doesn't matter a whole lot just because of the type of government they have there. The most important news here is that, we're talking about really nuclear warfare, right? North Korea does have nuclear weapons, and even if they don't have the ability to deliver one to the United States, I'm sure they have the ability to utilize their nuclear weapons, maybe against South Korea, loading them up on a submarine and trying to attack U.S., positions, whether they be like our aircraft carriers or Japan, South Korea, Guam, U.S. bases, around this area of the world. And the fact that the United States has a lot of nuclear weapons, and should war break out that, North Korea starts using their nukes, it's very likely that the U.S. uses theirs. And, this could get very dangerous and very deadly for a lot of people very, very quickly. All right. So now I think I got you all up to where we are on the process so far. I want to talk about some recent developments that are positive. We've been talking about this Inter-Korean Rail project for quite a while on the show now. It had looked not very great, that the outlook for this, mainly because U.S. sanctions and UN sanctions as well against North Korea would prevent this kind of rail project from taking place because of like the surveying that you need to do, and the fact that you would need to be in equal economic cooperation with North Korea in order to build this rail project. The U.S. Treasury Department and, State Department, at times when they've issued statements, they haven't been supportive of these kind of projects. There's also been cases where like South Korean bank branches are looking at opening offices in North Korea. However, we saw one positive here, and that is the UN Security Council voted to allow sanctions exemptions for the planning of the Inter-Korean rail line. So this isn't actually going to, be sanctions relief that will allow them to start laying traps tomorrow, but will let them to start do the things they need to do ahead of time, surveying the areas, trying to figure out where they're going to link up the rails and all the different kind of engineering work that I don't understand whatsoever that's going to need to go into this project. They're going to start being able to do now. So this is absolutely fantastic. Now, this was a UN Security Council resolution, and so that means that the Americans, at the very least, didn't use their veto power to stop this. And that's kind of representative of the credit that you could give Donald Trump for his role in this peace process. A lot of people say he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think so. But unlike Barack Obama, he hasn't just kind of like crossed his arms and said, I'm not going to do a single thing until the North Koreans completely and verifiably denuclearize. We saw him willing to have a summit with Kim Jong-un, and we've seen the United States scale down the war games in South Korea, something that North Korea has really protested against because they're simulations of the invasion of North Korea, decapitation strikes, stuff like that. Flying nuclear-capable bombers over the DMZ, very, very hostile acts. We've also just seen a reduction of rhetoric from the U.S. government towards North Korea as far as the hostility goes. I guess the rhetoric actually towards North Korea now is just much more favorable. So, these are big steps from the Trump side on it, and the fact that he hasn't, vetoed it and really killed the South Korean push for peace, I think is a good sign. I talked about on episode 274 with Will Porter, an article about John Bolton, that Mike Pompeo is actually the one running the Korean peace, kind of initiative out of the White House. So good, because John Bolton would probably ruin the peace agreement like he's ruined so many others. The man is an absolute bloodthirsty hawk that, should be stopped and kicked out of the White House and never listened to in respectable company again. And, Mike Pompeo does, some people say that, this is just the president's policy and he's taking orders. However, I think it's important to remember that when he was director of the CIA, and I'm sure there's not many things I would compliment him for as being director of the CIA, but the CIA did produce a report at that time saying that Kim Jong-un was a rational actor. This may have been an important step. Something that Scott Horton talks about often, you see, is that whenever we're looking to go to war with somebody, whether it be Saddam, Gaddafi, or the example that Scott always brings up, David Koresh, Waco Branch Davidians guy, they make the leaders out to be, these insane people that you can't reason with. And a lot of people painted Kim Jong-un in this light, that he's this little insane Asian guy, and I think probably a little bit of a racist caricature there, that he, he's just this guy that starves his people to death and is a terrible, terrible person. I'm sure a lot of that's true, just like with Saddam and Gaddafi. However, it turns out that he's not completely irrational and does seem to have somewhat of a coherent foreign policy strategy that he's attempting to implement. And, of course, I would say that the first thing he should do is free all of his people and probably willingly give up his nuclear weapons. At the same time, that could be a death sentence for him. So, yeah, I think he's trying to retain his hold on power while moving into the circle with the rest of the world, something that, that's probably an incredibly difficult balance to strike and figure out. But he is not a man who's acting irrationally, who we have to worry about waking up in the middle of the night and hitting just a nuclear button and sending off nuclear weapons, which is certainly, I think, the image of him in American mainstream culture through 2017. Some other projects going on between North and South Korea right now is a road to reconnect North and South Korea. And I guess in this process, they're clearing some area around the 38th parallel. And so, as I alluded to in the intro of the show, that means that you have some soldiers around like the construction equipment in the area. You have North Korean and South Korean, probably platoonish number of people, 10 to 8 soldiers on each side, standing around and having a conversation, like a couple of neighbors in the United States on each side of their fence, although there's, not a fence, just stakes in the ground there. And it looks like the conversation's relatively friendly and non-hostile. And so this is just, I think, as far as it goes, one of those visual things that helps to really, take another step in the right direction. When people see this, I think it immediately kind of is just such a disarming, image here. These two guys just having a pleasant conversation along the DMZ suggests that North and South Korea can get along. If their militaries can stand together and talk, it means their people can, their leaders can as well. So hopefully, this image continues to be shown. I'm not sure if this was like propaganda generated between the two countries or something that happened organically. You can see from the camera angle they have, the videos being taken from the South Korean side. It looks like pretty high quality camera, but I'm sure all these guys have like cell phones, and some of the cell phone cameras, the new iPhones take incredible video. And so I don't know if I could immediately dismiss that this was like a news camera and a propaganda act and just something that happened naturally. But, that these soldiers are coming up to each other and having a conversation is great. I mean, you can imagine at different circumstances where, the South Korean, North Koreans don't attend the Olympic Games in South Korea. And these groups of soldiers are shooting at each other now rather than having a friendly conversation. And one side is clearly just such a better circumstance than the other. Now, today, or Sunday, so the 25th of November here, I'm looking for a news story on this coverage because I see the video on Twitter and I would love to see like some kind of written story in English, in part so I could post it up on Immersion News and in my news roundup tomorrow. But also just to read, about if this was an orchestrated event or something that happened organically. And I could find almost no media coverage of it whatsoever. There's a 41-second video published by Reuters and then also posted up on the Washington Post of like kind of just this encounter. And I think they have some captions on the bottom and stuff like that. But there's no actual written story that I could find from any mainstream American news source at all on this event, which is, it seems to me to be an absolutely historic, kind of imagery event to have these, groups of soldiers just come up to each other and start talking. One thing that the media never hesitates to cover is anything that makes these talks look like they're not going in the right direction. We have David Sanger writing, and I believe the New York Times, I'll link to the article in the show notes page, although you guys really don't have to read it. But in his article, he makes the case that the North Koreans are exploiting kind of the warm relationship they're having with the United States and upgrading their missile capabilities. And he has a new study from CSIS that proves that. Now, I'm going to be kind of explaining why this study doesn't prove that. And there's 3 articles that I read that are absolutely fantastic on this, and I'll link to all 3 in the show notes page. I would just read these 3 articles and not read the Sanger piece, to be honest. One's by Peter Van Buren, one's by Gareth Porter, and one is by Tim Shorrock. And also to note that, other sources like CNN and NPR picked up this story, didn't really add much to it, but just kind of ran the same thing. Now, the most important thing is that the study itself, the CSIS study, doesn't actually find that North Korea is taking advantage of the kind of ceasefire deal with the United States and upgrading their bases, their military base capabilities. I guess I should just explain a little bit that what David Sanger says that this study found is that North Korea was updating some secret missile bases. Now, I believe the U.S. government and South Korean governments were aware that these bases existed, and the study actually found that since 2011, there haven't been any major upgrades to these bases, and only kind of minor, like, routine upgrades. So, like, if they're updating the way they keep water on the base or something like that, I'm not sure what the actual updates were. But they have nothing to do with their missile capability. In the Tim Shorrock article, he points out how that the dates from all the images used in the CSIS study were from prior to the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit, actually. And so it doesn't really make sense to say that Kim Jong-un has been taking advantage of Donald Trump since then, because all these images are from before that time. And so, from my understanding, those details alone pretty much debunk the entire David Sanger conclusion. I mean, the study itself doesn't draw the conclusions that David Sanger claims it does. And then, the images being from before the time that they would need to be to make the case that he's trying to make also completely, debunk his case. Now, it may seem odd to you that you have somebody from the New York Times completely lying in the paper, but, this is essentially what's going on. I think it just goes to show kind of the state of U.S. journalism in the age of Trump, where everybody is absolutely hysterical and writing nonsense. So I want to also link to the Scott Horton show interview of Gareth Porter on this subject, because then they go into the military-industrial complex angle a little bit. And I think Gareth helps to point out, in that section, how U.S. policy and how people could write these kind of things and get away with it. It's just kind of how far we've gone and how much power, this military-industrial complex now has. Overall, I think it's hard to say anything but good news, though, on the Korean front. The Koreans are still seemingly trying to get together very well. I think this UN vote is very significant. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell which way the U.S. voted here. All we could say is that they didn't veto, which had they vetoed that resolution for the sanctions exemption, it would have killed it, being a permanent member state. But at the very least, abstaining here, the UN hasn't updated their website on that vote yet. So I'll have that for you on the next show. But, again, we see Donald Trump at the very least not ruining the peace being driven here by the Koreas. And it seems like the world is better off for it. A couple things I just want to mention on other subjects before I wrap up here. In Afghanistan, there was a U.S. service member killed over the weekend. Hopefully we'll get more details what happened there. Most of the deaths this year by, kind of U.S. servicemen have been due to insider attacks. So we'll see if that's taking place still. The important part of the insider attacks is, commentators like Danny Surgeon have pointed out, is it creates so much mistrust between the U.S. and the Afghan soldiers that it really makes the nation building effort there impossible. And then we had a bombing at a mosque in the Coast province of Afghanistan there. The Haqqani network typically operates there, but I haven't seen a group claim credit for this attack. It targeted the Friday morning prayer worship by the soldiers, 27 killed in that, horrific attack. And it's just, it's like daily coming out of Afghanistan now that the Afghan government, their army is just taking such a toll. 20 people this day, 10 people the next day. They're losing different districts and provinces around Afghanistan. They're having trouble, bringing reinforcements whenever the Taliban launch a major offensive. So it doesn't look good as, we move forward here. The second thing I want to talk about is just the troops at the southern border. I talked about this and made it the subject of one of the shows a while back. And for a while there, I was thinking that maybe I was a little alarmist on it. Although now we have the U.S. government saying that the White House is issuing a statement allowing the soldiers at the southern border to use lethal force to defend Customs Border Patrol agents. This is certainly, kind of a scary thing, giving the Army the power to use lethal force on U.S. soil. although you do have Mattis, who kind of seems to be on the other side here, and the Pentagon in general seems to be on the other side of this issue. Actually, U.S. soldiers will not even be carrying guns at the border, so a little bit of a discrepancy there, maybe something that we'll have to see when the time comes. It certainly seems that Trump wants to be the one that's really taking charge and, having our soldiers engaged down there in a lot of effort to, as he would say, defend the border, whereas the Pentagon really doesn't want to have a law enforcement duty on U.S. soil. Looking at reports that the Pentagon will spend about $72 million on the U.S. deployment there through December 15th, and the Pentagon is pointing out that day when the soldiers will actually wrap up. So something to keep our eyes on. Certainly don't want U.S. forces having, a shooting roll down at the southern border. And I know, for most people, it's a pretty complicated issue what's going on there at the southern border. I would hope we could all agree, though, that U.S. soldiers probably aren't the answer. All right, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Check it out. Donate to the show there. Minds.com/immersion news. Great new social networking site. Twitter is at KYAAALE. Libertarian Union on Facebook. Immersionnews.com is my news website. I think that's everything I have to plug.